At least I don't think I snore. My wife says I do, but I think she's lying. I've never heard myself snore.
I heard myself snore.
I woke
myself. That's crazy.
I've woke myself up from it, but it's
Yeah.
because my head, I think, was propped up too
Well, that's
high.
how you know that you don't, because you wake up, all right?
If I was, yeah.
That's what I say.
Exactly.
I stood up all night one night to see if I snored, and I didn't.
That's pretty good. All right. All right, well, Sister Graver has 3 points, Pastor Graver has 2. Mr. Plomondon, Megan, John, Daniel, Mrs. Plomondon, and Mr. Hopple all have 1 point.
What about my negative 2 points?
Oh, you can't go in the negative. So, opportunity for points. People get on the board or increase the score. Did everyone read Deuteronomy chapter 3 and 4? See a lot of heads nodding, that's good. What'd you guys think of it? Did anything stand out to you? Anything you wanted to share? Anything? I underlined a bunch of verses in chapter 4. Oh, chapter 4 had a lot of good stuff in it.
Giants.
What's that?
There were giants.
Yeah, there was a review of that.
Just that Moses was not able to go into the promised land because of his sin. That stuck out to me. All those years that he led the children of Israel, but God said nope.
There is a serious consequence for disobedience.
He even asked God one more time if he could go.
Yeah.
And he's like, don't speak to me about this anymore. I've already said no.
Yeah. Like when you have kids and they keep nagging you, say, you keep asking about it. There's going to be consequences. I underlined a lot of verses in chapter 4. There's a lot of good stuff. I feel like the first 3 chapters kind of set the scene for what's going on, where they were and everything. And I think now we're going to get into some pretty good stuff. So I know it's hard sometimes, but I would really encourage everyone to read as they can. Because I think Deuteronomy's got a lot in there that could be very informative for us, but also I think you might get more out of Sunday school if we are reading together through Deuteronomy. How about the memorization of the 10 Commandments? Somebody got going on that yet? Huh?
Start with verse 1.
You start with verse 1 for the extra credit? I like it. Nice. All right. I haven't been doing so well on it either, but we'll get there. All right. What about last week? What did we talk about last week? Does anyone remember? Can anybody summarize some things we talked about last week? I'll ask again because now it's just Peace here. She takes notes.
I can't find the book.
Oh, man.
Yeah, that's right.
You guys don't go home and rewatch the Sunday school on YouTube? No? Like a refresher course? No. No.
Good idea.
The first thing I had is why God's laws are important.
Okay. That's pretty good, pretty good. So last week we talked about the importance of God's laws. We talked about truths that are proclaimed, truths about God that are proclaimed through his laws. We talked about that. We talked about truths about men that are proclaimed through his laws. We briefly spoke about the seriousness of breaking his laws. And if you read Deuteronomy this week, like we just talked about, we saw the seriousness of breaking his laws, the consequences that Moses faced for breaking the law, for being disobedient. And we talked about his laws being all-encompassing. So there's our review for last week. This week, I want to talk about the giving of the 10 Commandments. We're getting pretty close to actually getting into the 10 Commandments, but we have a couple more weeks of some other stuff that I want to go over. So today will be the giving of the 10 Commandments. Last week, I very briefly, you guys probably didn't even catch it because it was something I said just very briefly, but the laws of God are kind of broken up into 3 classes. Anybody know what those classes are? This would be worth the point because I'd be surprised if anybody.
The stuff you do, stuff you don't do, and then
So there's words.
Spiritual?
There are words specifically that break them up. I kind of just,
Shall not.
well, that's 3 words for one class of laws, but.
Your responsibility to God and your responsibility to others. And then,
No, not quite what I was looking for. All right, I'll just tell you. I said it very briefly, so you guys probably didn't even catch it. But we talked about the laws of God are broken into 3 groups, those being moral laws, ceremonial law, and civil law. And so the moral law is kind of known as the law of God. And we'll look at Romans chapter 7. To reference the commandments as the law of God. Romans chapter 7, verse 22. Megan, would you read that for us?
Romans 7:22, for I delight in the law of God after the inward man.
So there it's referenced as the law of God. And verse 25 also says, thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin. So it's referenced as the law of God. And then the law of Moses would include more of the ceremonial and civil law. And that being the civil laws, how to conduct yourselves with each other, how to, if your oxen goes crazy and goes into somebody else's property and destroys, there's a civil law to handle the repercussions of that, the restitution of that. You have to make it right. That's a civil law that Moses gave, that God gave to Moses and he told the Israelites. And then the ceremonial law, which kind of more represents in your sin or your offerings, there's a ceremonial way to prepare whatever animal. There's specific animals that are clean and unclean, how they're supposed to be prepared, how they're supposed to be sacrificed. So there's the civil and ceremonial law. And then to go with that, we'll look at Acts chapter 15 and verse 5. Acts 15 verse 5. Matthew, if you would read that, if you can.
But there rose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed, saying that it was needful to circumcise them, and to command them to keep the law of Moses.
So to be circumcised was a ceremonial law that made you clean or one of God's people. And then we have the law of Christ. We'll look at Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2.
bear ye one another's burden, and so fulfill the law of Christ.
So the law of Christ is kind of the new law. When Christ was on earth, he went over the laws and kind of gave new meaning to them, or made sure people understood the full meaning of the law. So the law of Christ is also the moral law, but Christ has become the mediator for that law between man and God. Here we go. We're going to do a sword drill. The law of Christ is God's moral law in the hands of a mediator. We all know that Christ is our mediator between us and God. I will give 1 point to whoever can find. Does anyone know the verse that speaks of Christ being the mediator between man and God?
One mediator between man and God is Lord Jesus Christ.
Do you know the reference?
I don't know it. I know the verse, but I don't know
Okay.
exactly what
It's 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5. 1 point for whoever finds it. Oh, you got your phone? Just automatically disqualified. That's good. You have to have pages for sword drill.
Cheers cheating.
I'm in the wrong years.
All right, Matthew's got Dr. Seuss, so good luck, Matthew. Okay, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5, go. 1 point.
For there is one God and one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus.
Man, that was fast. That was fast. Okay, Mrs. P is on the board for 2 points now. Moving up in the world. All right, so we know that God's moral law is in the hands of the mediator. We know that Christ is our mediator. The law of God, what was termed the law of God, is now termed the law of Christ. As it relates to God's children, it's the law of Christ. The Ten Commandments fall under the classifications of moral law, and as such are a rule and standard of human conduct and attitude. The Ten Commandments are a summary of the whole of God's moral teachings. All right, so let's look at the giving of the Ten Commandments. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 3. Megan, did you read? Okay, yeah, it's Mrs. Hop. If you would read Exodus chapter 3 and verse 12.
And he said, certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. That's the wrong one. No?
Nope, that's it. That's the one. So does anyone know what mountain is being spoke of in this verse? I'll give you a point.
Sinai?
It is Mount Sinai.
I needed a point.
Yeah, she's on the board now. You guys are gonna cry one day when you find out what happens to the person that gets the most points into this class. All right. You get a big hug from me.
Yeah.
Okay, so the mountain that is spoken of in verse 12 is Mount Sinai, and that is the same mountain that Moses was on when God gave the Ten Commandments. So our first point under the giving of the commandments, we'll look at the Ten Commandments were given on Mount Sinai. And just as we read, while Moses was shepherding Jethro's flock in Midian, the Lord promised him after the Exodus. Does everyone know what that is? Everyone know what Exodus is?
Exiting of Egypt.
Yes. It is a mass departure of people, especially immigrants. So it refers to the mass of the Hebrews leaving Egypt. Thus the name of the book, Exodus. Where was I? The Lord promised him after the Exodus that he would come to Mount Sinai to worship. 3 months after the Hebrews were delivered from their bondage in Egypt, they came to Mount Sinai. Let's turn to Exodus 19, verse 1. Daniel, I think that's you, if you read 19, verse 1.
In the third month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai.
So there you go, you know I wasn't lying. After the arrival, God began to prepare the people for worship. Moses received a list of requirements that the Israelites were supposed to follow to prepare themselves to meet with God. The first thing that they were told to do is that they must be willing to obey. So just for us, we must be willing to obey. Properly serve God, we first must be willing to obey. If you come to church and, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's read chapter 19 still in verse 5 through 8. So Mr. B, would you read Exodus 19 verses 5 through 8?
Now therefore, if you obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then you shall be peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord hath spoken we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord.
So in verse 5 he says, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant. And in verse 8, the people say, all that the Lord hath spoken we will do. So there's a willingness to obey. And just a convicting part of, are we willing to obey? If we come to church and we feel we heard from the Lord something we're convicted of, will there be a willingness to obey? If there is not, then it'll be hard to worship him and serve him properly. In fact, I should just say you cannot serve him and worship him properly if you are not willing to obey him first. Our second point, was there any questions, is there any comments on that? Any thoughts? Our willingness to obey? Just leave it open. I don't know. If somebody has a thought, just share. Our second point, preparation. To meet with the Lord, there must be a desire to hear from God. Mrs. B, will you read Exodus 19, verse 9?
And the Lord said unto Moses, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever. And Moses told the words of the people unto the Lord.
So there must be a desire to hear from God. Do you desire to hear from God today? To come to church ready to hear from the Lord, excited and prepared to hear from him, and through what our pastor is prepared to preach, do we desire to hear? Just as the Lord commanded the Israelites to be prepared to hear and ready to hear from him. If we are not, how can we worship and serve God if we weren't ready to hear from him? Are there any thoughts on that?
Could you repeat
The whole part?
the question?
How can we worship and serve God properly if we don't desire to hear from him? All right, our third point, there must be consecration. What is consecration? Does anyone know what that means?
Set apart for a holy purpose?
Sacred, yeah, to make sacred, set apart. So it's the action of making or declaring something sacred, which is typically churches. Churches are consecrated or set apart. It's a good definition as well. Now we'll read verses 10 and 11. Chris, are you able to read Exodus 19, 10 and 11?
Yep. The Lord said to Moses, Go to the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and be ready against the third day, for the third day the Lord will come down to the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai.
So there has to be a consecration. They have to make themselves ready. I told them to wash their clothes, prepare yourselves, and I think we might say maybe we wouldn't wash our clothes because obviously we have that ability to wash our clothes quite frequently, and we don't really wear dirty clothes, except Daniel. But typically, well, I'm sorry, I lost my spot. I think we would say maybe instead of washing clothes, we would wear our best clothes, wear your best to church, dress nicely, prepare yourself, consecrate, and be prepared, because meeting with the Lord in church is sacred, and we have to consecrate ourselves. Clean yourselves, get yourselves ready, mentally, as we just read, being willing to obey and have a desire to hear. So you prepare yourself mentally, but also physically prepare yourself. Clean yourself, wear your best clothes, and be ready to meet with God, because it is sacred and we ought to treat it as such. All right, the fourth and last point is there must be a reverence for God. What is reverence?
Holding up.
Holding up?
Honor?
I'd say a respect.
Yeah,
And all.
yeah, a respect and awe. Holding up, what did you say, Mrs. Hobb?
Honor?
Honor. Those are good too. I think those can go with it. Reverence is a feeling or attitude of deep respect. And kind of like what Mrs. P said also, an awe. A humbling fear of God and awe, because you know what He's capable of and you have a reverence and a respect for Him. Reverence involves a humbling of the self and respect, a recognition of something that is greater than yourself. In this case, we would say this is God. We'll read Exodus chapter 19, verse 12. Darrell, are you able to read Exodus 19, verse 12?
Yeah. And thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying, Take ye to yourselves that ye go not up into the mount, or touch the border of it, whosoever touches the mount shall be surely put to death.
So they're told not to touch the, the mount, the roundabout. And if they did, they'd be put to death. I think if there was something in this church that the Lord said, don't touch, and if you do, you'll be put to death, that would cause a reverence for me to have for God. There would be a fear of God, because I know if I go touch the pulpit or whatever it may be, I'm gonna die. So that would cause me to have reverence for the Lord. The other thing we'll look at is after 3 days, there was a revelation from God. This is kind of a lengthy read. It'll be verse 16 through the end of the chapter, so it's about 10 verses. So do you guys, Mr. and Mrs. P, do you guys want to split that up? You both read 5.
Can you repeat where?
Exodus 19, 16 through 25.
And it came to pass on the 3rd day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mountain. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice.
And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain. And the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord his gaze, and many of them perish. And let the priests also, which came near to the Lord, sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. And Moses said unto the Lord, The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for thou chargest us, saying, Set bonds about the mountain, and sanctify. And the Lord said unto him, Away, get thee down, and thou shalt come up, thou and Aaron with thee. But let not the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break forth upon them. So Moses went down unto the people, and spake unto them.
All right. So the commandments were given in a twofold manner. That'll be our second section of the giving of the 10 Commandments. This will be section 2. The 10 Commandments were given in a twofold manner. One way they were given is by an audible voice of the Lord. He spoke unto Moses and gave him the 10 Commandments. The second way they were given is written on 2 tables of stone by the finger of God. There were 2 tables given to Moses, written by God himself. These 2 were the first 2 were broken by Moses. In Exodus 32, Exodus chapter 32, verse 16. I think we're back to the front. Unless, Molly, did you want to read that? Okay. Exodus 32, 16 and 19, please.
Through 19 or just 19?
Just 16 and 19.
And the tables were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, graven upon the table. And it came to pass, as soon as he came nigh unto the camp, that he saw the calf, and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tables out of his hand, and brake them beneath the mount.
So Moses broke the first set out of anger. I think if you follow the life of Moses, I think he had some rage, he had some anger problems. And I can relate to Moses a little bit, I think, because people irritate me, and I think the Israelites irritated him to a deep degree a lot of times.
They're always whining and moaning.
Oh, man, I'd have hit the rock with the staff. I might have hit somebody upside the head, but I probably would have had some rage too. But there were two sets of tables. There were two others given later. We'll turn to Exodus 34, verse 1. And I love this verse. I just find some humor in it. But Matthew, would you read Exodus 34, verse 1?
And the Lord said unto Moses, Hew thee 2 tables of stone like unto the first. And I will write upon these tables the words that were in the first tables which thou breakest.
I love the last 3 words. Like, you didn't have to add that at all. We all knew what happened to them. We just read. He could have just said, I will write upon these tables the words which were on the first. And that could have been the first. But he adds in, which thou breakest. It's like, I'll remake the ones just like the first that you broke. I don't know. I kind of like the end of that verse. It's just kind of funny. But it's probably, I should probably look at it more serious in the sense that God probably convicted him again of his anger. Just relax. You don't need to freak out all the time. These were afterwards laid up in the Ark of the Covenant. These commandments are referred to as the 10 Commandments. We'll read chapter 34, turn to verse 28. We'll see these referred to as the 10 Commandments. 34:28.
And he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He did neither eat bread nor drink water, and he wrote upon the tables the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments.
And we see in that same verse that they are referred to as the words of the covenant. So these are referred to as the 10 Commandments, the words of the covenant. They're also referred to as the testimony of God. We'll turn back to Exodus 25 and verse 16.
And thou shalt put into the ark the testimony which I gave, or which I shall give unto thee, or give thee.
So we see they're referred to as the testimony of the Lord's testimony, the testimony of God. They are also referred to as 2 tables of stone. We'll see that in Deuteronomy chapter 9, in verse 10. Deuteronomy 9, verse 10.
And the Lord delivered unto me 2 tables of stone, written with the finger of God, and on them was written according to all the words which the Lord spake with you in the mount, out of the midst of the fire in the day of the assembly.
The one thing I've noticed due to this study and just reading through the Old Testament and the book of Deuteronomy is how often the 10 Commandments are referenced, how often they come up. And I think it just shows the importance of them, how important they were, how relevant they were. And the importance of them is still just as important today. All right. The third section of the giving of the 10 Commandments we'll look at is that the 10 Commandments were given in love. Like everything else that God has given, the law is a manifestation of his love, of his goodness and mercy, and is a provision of his grace. Now, oftentimes, the world confuses and makes the law and grace an enemy. And they kind of work against each other, and they argue if salvation is grace or law. Grace and law are not enemies, though. They coincide and work together. The law is used to convict you, an unsaved soul, to convict them of their need of Christ. And as we see, they're given in love. And we'll see that. We've got a lot of different verses to look up. And we'll see how they are a manifestation of his love, of his goodness, mercy, and grace. we'll move on to our fourth point of the giving of the Ten Commandments, which is the Ten Commandments were given with a purpose. Somebody have anything they want to add or say? Just want to keep opening that up.
You know, going back to, there must be, like a reverence, or awe, honor, respect. I find, like, coming into the house of the Lord, sometimes I'm kind of flippant,
Yeah.
especially after Sunday morning service and we eat. And then we come back in here into, you know, I have to remind myself, like, we're coming back in to hear from God. Like those 4 points that you gave were really, really good. Just to remind me of that, you know,
Yeah.
like, yes, we like to be social. And I know Pastor Graves talked about that too, but I don't always do that. I don't. I'm like,
Kind of
oh,
just
okay,
mosey over here after
Yeah, yeah.
whatever.
So that was a good reminder to me.
Yeah, it's hard, but I think too, we get so much more out of the service
Yeah.
if we are mentally prepared. If we recognize we are here to hear from the Lord. And whatever, you know, we listen to a man preach, but whatever he is preaching, it's what the Lord has put on his heart. And the Lord is speaking through him. And he's preaching the living word. So we are hearing from the Lord. And it definitely becomes mundane. It becomes, you know, it's what we do every Wednesday night, every Sunday. And it does become just routine and it maybe loses its specialness, but it shouldn't. I mean, it's our own fault that it does, because we aren't preparing ourselves. Yeah, it was convicting to me too to go through that.
Also, you see a ton of the patience of God. Like, just think of like how incredible that the ability that Moses had to meet with God and to receive those tablets and to like for him to just break them and God be like, well, I'll make you another pair. But like he could have struck him down, he could have done this, could have made an example of him. He like has so much patience for us when we don't deserve it. Like that was probably something very disrespectful that he did to break something that God gave him with his own hands. But he had patience with him. He like, you know, probably told him like, you know, can't do that, shouldn't do that. But like he seemingly like forgave him and just didn't, you know, make a fool of him.
Yeah.
But just
Yeah,
to
he didn't
see the
make an
patience
example
that
of
God
him.
has for us when we don't deserve it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
That's
do
good.
feel like God
Good point.
probably knew his heart though, and know that he did it out of zeal for the Lord also.
Yeah, definitely.
Could you imagine if you had to break each stone tablet and you broke the law? God, you broke it. These ones are broken. Get a new one.
Yeah.
Like, man, you hew the stone.
Yeah,
That'd take a lot of work.
there'd be a lot of stones.
In our reading about in Deuteronomy and about the Ten Commandments, we ran across some commentaries that apparently there's a lot of scholars that believe that the Ten Commandments was written on two tables of stone, but they were the same ones. That it was a copy. That all 10 were written on each one. Because anything of importance was always done in twos. When things were like rewritten, it was always done in twos, so there was always another copy. Just information, don't know, we weren't there, so, but interesting.
So they were saying that there was already a second one made?
No, that when God wrote two of them, he did the Ten Commandments on one and the Ten Commandments on the second, that they're identical. It wasn't like 5 commandments on one stone, 5 on the other stone, like we see it in the movies.
Okay.
And he broke both of them?
Yeah.
So they're, okay.
Another thing I noticed,
Interesting, it's a commentary, but yeah, it's interesting.
I noticed in the reading today that it was written on both sides of them also.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting thoughts. I guess I haven't really saw anything that would turn me one way or another
Yeah.
for that, but it's interesting. All right, so moving on to, was there anything else? Anybody else? Any thoughts? All right. Moving on to the Ten Commandments given for a purpose. The question is asked in Galatians chapter 3. Turn to Galatians chapter 3, verse 19.
Wherefore then serveth the law. It was added because of transgressions, so the seed should come to whom the promise was made. And it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator.
So the question is asked, wherefore then serveth the law? Why the law? Why are you serving the law? The question being asked. The law of God is used to proclaim God's dominion and authority. God is the supreme authority. I guess let's turn to 1 Chronicles. We'll see God is the supreme authority. In 1 Chronicles, chapter 29, verse 11 through 12. Mr. B, I think we're back up to you. 1 Chronicles.
Thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in the heaven and in the earth is thine. Thine is the kingdom, O Lord, and thou art exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come of thee, and thou reignest over all. And in thine hand is power and might, and in thine hand it is to make great and to give strength unto all.
So we see in these two verses that God is the ultimate authority. He is the supreme authority, the ruler and judge. There's nothing that God does not have absolute authority over. God has absolute authority, and it is by right. The basic and foundational truth that must always be acknowledged by God. The basic and foundational truth that must always be acknowledged by man is that God has an absolute and universal right of authority. He has absolute and universal claim, and such is unlimited. We are all debtors to God. Just as the psalmist said in chapter 116, verse 12. Psalm 116, verse 12. Chris, I think this is me. Almost skipped it.
What shall I render unto the Lord for all his benefits toward me?
What will I give in return to the Lord? How can we repay him for all that he's done for us? We are all debtors to the Lord. What shall I render unto the Lord for all his benefits toward me? The psalmist also says in chapter 29, verse 2.
Give unto the Lord the glory due unto his name. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness.
Give unto the Lord the glory due unto his name. God has a due that is absolutely essential to one's spiritual well-being, not to fail to consider and acknowledge the absolute rights and claims of God, and not be guilty of treating God's rights and claims last and least of all. The Ten Commandments are a reminder of God's absolute authority. As the Ten Commandments are stated as moral absolutes, there are no conditions attached to a single one of these Ten Commandments. They are all absolutes. Whether they are stated in a negative or positive way, which is to say, thou shalt not would be more of a negative stated, thou shalt is more of a positive. Whether stated in a negative or positive way, they are absolutes, just like the authority of God. The law of God is used to manifest man's guilt. Like I was just talking a minute ago before about the law of God being given in love, grace, and mercy. The law is used to convict man of his guilt. When the Lord is about to save an individual, he sends the law to him to reveal to him his vileness and his need of salvation. We'll read Romans chapter 5, verse 20. Romans chapter 5 and verse 20. Darrell, are you able to read that?
Yeah. Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound, but where sin abounded, grace did much more abound.
So you see, through man's obedience and his failure to hear, many were made sinners. So through obedience of the one man, the many will be made righteous and acceptable to God. Due to what Christ did for us, sinners are made. I'm sorry. The law came to increase and expand the awareness of the trespass and defining of sin. But where sin increased, God's remarkable and gracious gift of grace, his unmerited favor, has surpassed and increased all the more. We'll read also Romans 7, verse 9.
Everyone gave the Son grace that is greater than all our
Romans 7:9, for I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died.
So I was alive without the knowledge of the law. When the commandments came and I understood the meaning of the law, sin became alive and I died. The law has sentenced man to death because of his disobedience to God's laws. So we see that the law of God is used to manifest man's guilt and to show him his need of Christ. The law of God is, our third point is the law of God is used to slay all hope of salvation by a reformed life. And that kind of goes with what we just read. But does anyone, do you all understand what that means, a reformed life? What that means, what that is?
life that is redirected to serve a different purpose. Reformed meaning like turn back from what you were.
Yeah,
Made
I think
better.
it's kind of, yeah, you stop doing this and that, and you start doing good things, which are all, that's good, but that in itself is not salvation. You cannot gain salvation by attempting to stop sinning and following the Lord's law correctly.
Basically, 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away, behold, all things are become new. I would consider that reformed.
Yeah,
I was gonna say changed.
yeah, and you can change the way you live. A lot of people say men don't change, or mankind cannot change. I think some people can change. They can change the way they live, and that's all good things. I mean, to stop living in bad things you're doing, to give up drinking or whatever sin you may be entrapped in, that's all good things, and you will reap the benefits of living a clean life. But that in and of itself is not salvation.
But it's not you that changes, it's Christ that changes, or God that changes.
Right. So just as we read in Romans 7:9, I was alive without the law once. When the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And we see that a reformed life is not the way to salvation. The fourth point is the law of God is used to reveal the value of a Savior. We'll read Galatians chapter 3, verse 24.
So you're talking reformed as not salvation.
Well,
Sorry, I misunderstood what you were saying.
yeah, just
Yeah.
in and of itself, you can change the way you
Right.
live maybe, and you can give up whatever sin you may be entrapped in, whatever it is.
Yeah.
That and that's good, but that's not,
Changing what you do,
you
yeah.
aren't saved because you changed the way you live.
Right.
But through salvation, your life will be changed.
Mhm.
All right, we got Galatians 3:24 says, wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith.
So the law of God is referenced here as a schoolmaster. You know what a schoolmaster is?
Teacher.
It's a teacher.
Tutor, guardian.
Yeah.
That's responsible for discipline.
I like that definition because it includes the discipline. And this thing is like possibly new. The Greek word for schoolmaster is pedagogus, which means the child conductor. So this person was in charge, was a slave, and who had the responsibility of educating young boys till they became of age. And I think we see the picture of salvation from a schoolmaster, that the law is in charge, kind of brings people to the point of seeing their need for salvation. And once you are saved, you no longer need necessarily, I want to be careful how I say this, we don't need the law to know how to live necessarily, because we voluntarily we don't need the schoolmaster to discipline us, to force us to live a way, because we want to voluntarily live that way because of what Christ did for us. Does that make sense? I want to be careful how I say that, because obviously the law still pertains to us, but voluntarily we desire to live for the Lord by His law, not because we'll go to hell if we don't, kind of what we've talked about in the past. So after the faith has come, we are no longer under the schoolmaster. We are no longer under the punishment of not following the law, but voluntarily we will obey the authority of the law to live for God. The law of God is also used to keep us from self-righteousness. We can see the law and see how we could never live accordingly to the law, and so we are reminded that it is only by Christ that we have salvation, and not in and of ourselves. So the law is used to keep us from self-righteousness. The law of God is used to serve as a standard of conduct for man. We can read through the last 6 commandments are all in reference to how we ought to live with others. So there's honoring your mother and father, not stealing, not committing adultery. I can't recite all of them, but not coveting what your neighbor has. All these laws pertain to how we ought to conduct ourselves with other people that are around us. So I'll wrap this up because we're way over, I'm sorry. But whether moral, civil, or ceremonial, the laws of God were never intended to give salvation. And that is what I have. Are there any thoughts, questions, or comments? Nothing? All right. Then we will close in prayer. Daniel, would you close in prayer, please?
Father, thank you so much for the day that you set aside for us to be able to come to your house, Lord. Thank you so much for it. Pray that we wouldn't be here because of a repetition of our daily lives, Lord, that we would be here because we want to be here, because you deserve it, Lord. Thank you so much for giving of your law, Lord. Pray that you would just put upon our hearts a desire to adhere to it, because we love you, Lord, and you deserve it. And you sent your Son to die for us, Lord, and that should be the reason that we're here serving you, Lord, not because we want to escape a place that we don't want to go, Lord, but because we want to serve a risen Lord that is deserving of our love, Lord. Just pray that you would just continue to be with this study as we go through it, Lord. Just pray that it would help us and that it would remind us of a lot of things, Lord, that we might not think about in our daily life, Lord, that we just need to impress upon our hearts more and more. Thank you so much for giving us up the words that you've been giving them, Lord. Pray that you would just be with Pastor Graver as he comes over here and preaches your morning service, Lord. Just pray that we would just have hearts ready to listen. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.